On the farm out in Archery, Georgia, we didn't really have any close white neighbors. All of my neighbors were African Americans, were black families. And so when I was a little child, from 4 years old on up till I was 16, my closest friends, my playmates, the people with whom I worked in the fields and went fishing and hunting and played baseball and so forth, were African American children, my same age group. And only when I came to Plains to go to school or go to church on Sundays was I really immersed in a white culture. So I basically grew up among black people who really shaped my life in a very beneficial way. This was during a strict segregation era when there was no integration of black and white people in churches or in schools. Black people were not permitted to serve on the jury for trials. They were not permitted to vote in Georgia. And a lot of this segregation or division of the two races was nationwide. So we just lived in a culture that was not challenged then concerning racial segregation, but I was integrated my whole young life. My mother was a registered nurse, and she never did pay any attention to racial segregation because she was part of the medical community. And she worked primarily during the latter part of my young life when I was a teenager in private nursing duty in the homes of our neighbors around Archery. There were probably a total of, I'd say, 200 black people who lived in the Archery large farming community. And my mother would nurse when there was a sick person in one of those families. She was supposed to get $6 a day for 20 hours of duty, but she was only off duty from 10 o'clock at night till 2 o'clock in the morning, so we very seldom saw my mother. And so she paid no attention, as I said, to the racial segregation. And it was not until I was about 14 years old, I wrote a poem about this, that there sprung up between me and my black playmates a kind of a dividing wall. I think what happened in looking back on it was that their families told them it was time for me and them to start establishing the racial segregation that existed among adults. So from then on, they kind of deferred to me in a way that was uncomfortable for me and perhaps for them as well. And by then, too, when I was about 14 years old, I was more interested in playing basketball in Plains High School and having dates with girls and so forth. So I was, I guess, ready for the change. I moved from a black culture where I still lived into a much more interrelationship with white people. And I realized then, as I became an adult, that this was a tremendous handicap, a millstone around the necks, not only of the black neighbors who were persecuted and not given their equal rights as citizens, but also the white people who had to maintain that despicable kind of segregation. And so when I later became a state senator and a governor and a president, that issue was very important to me, to promote civil rights in the United States and human rights around the world. So I would say that that was a wonderful thing that happened to me, was being able to live in that kind of culture when I was a child. The barn was the center of our attention on the farm because all of our work was focused there. It was a very exciting place, as a matter of fact. We caught the mules and horses early in the morning, took them to the field hooked to wagons and plows. That's where we brought them back at night for feed and for watering. We also had a good time around the barn. For instance, when Daddy threshed oats and wheat, we had the thresher machine just behind the barn, and we would have a big pile of loose hay. We used to get a running start in the loft of the barn and leap out of the window and land on the soft pile of hay. Throughout my young life, I worked and played with my boyhood neighbors. My neighbors were African American, and we were equal to one another. But when I was about 14 years old, there was a profound experience that I had that didn't seem to be important at the time. But later in my life, I realized that it was one of the turning points in my life. I wrote a poem about it. the Pasture Gate. This empty house 3 miles from town was where I lived. Here I was back and found most homes around were gone. The folks who stayed here now were black, like Johnny and A.D., my friends. As boys, we worked in Daddy's fields, hunted rabbits, squirrels, and quail, caught and cooked catfish and eels, searched the land for arrowheads, tried to fly the smallest kite, steered barrel hoops with strands of wire, and wrestled hard. At times we'd fight, without a thought who might be boss, who was smartest or the best. The leader for a few brief hours was who had won the last contest. But then we were 14 or so. As we approached the pasture gate, they went to open it and then stood back. This made me hesitate. Sure, it must have been a joke, a tripwire maybe they had planned. I reckon they had to obey their parents' prompting or command. We only saw it vaguely then, but we were transformed at that place. A silent line was drawn between friend and friend, race and race.